everyone. I'm Mary Mason. I'm the chair of the Board of Trustees here at East Shore Unitarian Universalist Church. I would like to welcome you to a church of reverence where we stand in awe of the enormous potential of human nature and the wonder of nature all around us. I welcome you to a church of love where we genuinely care for one another and seek to make this world a better place for all living things. I welcome you to a church of discovery where we seek our individual spiritual paths and the path to truth, and where we support one another in our searches. And I welcome you to a church of connectedness where we strive to nurture meaningful connections to each other, to the world around us, and the universe beyond. You are welcome to a church that values reverence, love, discovery, and connectedness.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. A little slow in the uptake there at first. I'm Reverend George Buchanan. I'm one of a team of ministers who are serving this congregation for this church year. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the light. We're facing a time of the shortest days and longest nights. We're in the midst of and just about to finish the Jewish Festival of Lights, Hanukkah. And the winter solstice and Christmas are coming soon. And with the colder weather and diminished sunlight, we seek the deeper warmth and light living among us and within us. So in this spirit, let's begin worship together.
In our bond of union, among the things we pledge is to not think alike, but to journey together. As we journey together today, we light our chalice. The symbolism is and should be what you think it is. We're at a time in our service now when we share our joys and cares, either out loud or in our hearts. We do this by placing stones that we've brought to church into the bowl in the center of the sanctuary, or a stone that you picked up here. Eventually, the stones that are in the bowl will go back into our landscaping and become part of the fabric of this place. So if you'd like to pick up a stone now, there's a bowl at the back of the aisle that you can grab a stone in, and we will have a period of silence, after which we will place the stones when you hear the sounding of the singing bowl. Prior to that, I will take a look at our book that has a home out on the pedestal in the narthex, where we place those things which we wish to have shared with one another. All right, we have a entry here that doesn't have anybody's name attached to it. And it says this: despite being fully vaccinated and boosted, Reverend Joe has contracted COVID and is in quarantine until December 13th. That would be Joe Cherry, for anyone who may not know. He's the spouse of Reverend... Pardon me?
Joe Donatone, our minister that's helping us now.
Okay, Joe Donatone. Okay, very good. Sorry. Thank you. He is experiencing mild symptoms. He would love all the healing energy you would wish to throw his way. All right, we'll now have a period of silence, and when the singing bowl sounds, we'll go ahead and place the stones as you feel moved to do so.
Many of you will be familiar with the prayer in the Christian New Testament, the Lord's Prayer. That was originally written in Aramaic, an ancient Middle Eastern language, and Aramaic apparently allows for lots of different interpretations and different ways of translating it. So here's a interesting, I think, variation on what we know as the Lord's Prayer. And it's from Neil Douglas Klotz in Prayers of the Cosmos. O Birther, Father, Mother of the Cosmos, focus your light within us, make it useful. Create your reign of unity now, through our fiery hearts and willing hands. Help us love beyond our ideals, and sprout acts of compassion for all creatures. Animate the earth within us. We then feel the wisdom underneath supporting all. Untangle the knots within so that we can mend our heart's simple ties to each other. Don't let surface things delude us, but free us from what holds us back from our true purpose. Out of you, the astonishing fire, returning light and sound to the cosmos. Amen. In our Unitarian Universalist denomination, we have our 7 principles. We also identify 6 sources of wisdom. And the 5th of these sources reminds us to draw on humanist teachings which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science and warn us against idolatries of the mind and spirit. Now, I'm someone who carefully attends to this 5th source, and I'm particularly aware of the need to avoid idolatries of the mind and spirit. And with that said, I also pray. I have times of personal prayer just for myself. And as a minister and worship leader, I offer community prayers, as we've already done together here this morning. So, question, am I being consistent? Are my prayers, both personal and communal, consistent with my intention to avoid idolatry? My answer is yes, an emphatic yes. And I'll take the next few minutes to explain my yes. And this will be a personal exploration of my own experience with prayer. And each of you will have your own experience of this. I hope my stories might illuminate some of your experience and what you've learned. To begin, I need to dig back deep into my childhood and youth. I grew up in the 1960s and 70s in a Unitarian Universalist congregation in Canada, in the suburb of Montreal. Now, this congregation was one with a strong humanist culture. And many of our congregations at that time had the same humanist culture. So what does it mean to have such a culture? For me, I mean that our congregational life was focused on learning how to live wisely. And living wisely meant basing what we did on the finding of science and the collected works of poets and philosophers. We spent very little time with the Christian Bible and other traditional religious texts. Pardon me. One humorist suggested that we almost never mention God or Jesus unless somebody dropped a casserole on their foot in the kitchen or something. For me as a teenager, it was personally embarrassing because my parents were the only family on the street to hold a solstice party instead of a Christmas party. And you can imagine trying to explain that to the guys at the table in the high school cafeteria. Anyway, I'm sure you've had more embarrassing incidents with your parents, but that was mine. Take you back to that time in the 1960s, in our denomination, we hadn't put our principles and sources into written form yet. And we were just beginning in a few places to use the flaming chalice in our congregations, but it wasn't at all universal. So, it's a time with no 7 principles, no 6 sources, and no flaming chalice. Very different than now. Pardon me. No, I'm not advocating going back. It was a difficult and dangerous time, and our congregations were, certainly the one I was in, were rife with racism and sexism and homophobia. So I wouldn't want to go back. But one thing was true, we still, even though we had not formally described our principles and sources in writing, most of us were trying to practice the ideas in the 5th source, tending to the voice of reason, the findings of science, and avoiding idolatry. Pardon me. For me, as a young man nurtured in this culture, avoiding idolatry meant avoiding prayer, and indeed any attempt to invoke my relationship with underlying reality in prayer form. There's a humorous story, a joke to illustrate this. It's about a humanist a Unitarian Universalist, who's walking high in the mountains in Colorado, beautiful view. And he's just totally taken aback by the stunning vistas in front of him. And all of a sudden, there's a quiet voice that he hears, and the voice says, be careful, my son. And he looks around and said, who's that? And the voice says, this is God. Please be careful. And the Unitarian Universalist looks around and he says, you're a woman. And God says, yes, please be careful. So he walks on a little bit and he's trying to be careful, but he comes around a corner and the view is so stunning, and then his foot slips on a rock and he slides all the way down about 20 feet, grabs onto a pine tree sticking up, and is hanging there with his legs over a precipice. And the voice comes back, and it says, let go, my son. And the Unitarian Universalist is stuck like this, hanging onto the branch, and he says, are you sure? And God says, let go, my son. And the Unitarian Universalist says, is there someone else up there I can talk to? I tell that story mostly on myself because I'm pretty sure there's times when the divine truth has been revealed, that God has spoken to me, and I didn't hear it. So I don't really know who God is or what God is. She hasn't told me yet. We sampled several prayer forms already this morning. You heard a version of the Lord's Prayer. You heard the choir wonderfully singing Spirit of Life and Find a Stillness. And I suggest that all three of these are forms of prayer that fit the definition that one UU minister in the 20th century said. He said, what is it to pray but to open our hearts? And all of those are inviting us to open our hearts. Now, I'm pretty sure my 18-year-old self, the one who had been arguing with God on the precipice, would have been uncomfortable, and maybe very uncomfortable with any of these prayer forms. But now at 68, I hunger for prayers in the forms that we use today. So in this respect, I'm a different person now. The fifth source still applies. However, I'm much more willing to open my heart to what the Lord's Prayer called the astonishing fire. The key experience along the way was, and all our ministers and clergy and all other denominations have to go through this. It's called clinical pastoral education. And what that means is usually you spend 4 months in a hospital with a group of other people, student priests, student rabbis, student ministers, and you're all sent out into the hospital wards to pray and counsel with whoever is there. So if there's a Jewish patient, you do Jewish prayers. And if there's a Hindu patient, you do Hindu prayers. And if there's an Episcopal patient, you do Episcopal prayers. Think of it as kind of a spiritual boot camp or a prayer boot camp. I remember when, as someone who didn't know who God was yet, I struggled with this. I remember being sent to a hospital room of somebody, and I'll call her Susan. That's not her real name, but and the nurse's note said that she was a member of a 12-step program and a very fervent believer in God. And she also had a lung condition which made it hard to breathe. And she somehow got the impression that God was no longer there for her. And so she was anxious and she was having trouble breathing. So I went in and I knew about higher powers, what a higher power was and what mine was, sort of, for prayer purposes. So we talked about that, and we did a little prayer together. And afterwards, at the end of it, she said, "Oh, George, I feel so much better." It actually had helped her calm down and reduce her breathing. And of course, the next day, she contacted the nurse again, and she said, "I really like that chaplain. Can I go to his church?" And thank goodness the rule was you weren't allowed to invite hospital patients to your church, because she would have found out what an odd bunch we are. I was having trouble understanding any of this, really. And then one of my supervisors, she said, "George, you're God's man in that hospital room." And I struggled with this because I still didn't know who God was. But then I transposed it for myself and I said, "I'm love's man in those hospital rooms." And that really worked for me, because I didn't know who God was, but I knew what love was. And that love is the manifestation of the divine. Whatever the divine is, when we're truly loving with one another, just like it says here, on the side of love, that's the divine. That's what we're called to. And so that really transformed my life, being recognized as love's man, recognizing myself as love's man. Pardon me. And it leads to my own personal prayer question now. When I'm praying by myself, my question to myself is, what does love do now? Which means, what's the loving thing that I can do next? How can I do something differently that will be more loving? And I sure don't claim to succeed at that all the time, make mistakes all the time, but it's still the right personal prayer question for me. One other story. Once I became ordained and was out serving a congregation, I would go and pray with individuals and families if they asked for it. And one day I got an emergency call to go to the hospital. There was a little girl there, 2 years old, and she had a throat lesion that needed emergency surgery. So I went over to the hospital, and she was there, and her parents were there. And I knew that her parents, her name was Robin. Oh, that's not really her name, but we'll call her Robin. I knew that Robin's parents were much more theistic than I was and am. They had a much stronger sense of personal God. So I listened to them for a little while, and we talked about the prognosis, and then we all prayed together. And I started to pray, and I talked about inviting God in the same way that we did in our prayer. We talked about spirit of life coming in, or the spirit of the cosmos. And I said that I prayed that the doctors and nurses would work with love and care on the little girl. And by the end of the prayer, I was crying and the parents were crying. And the little girl was happy because I'd also brought a little stuffed rabbit. That's what she did with me. Anyway, it had a happy ending. The operation was a success, and I'm sure Robin is off somewhere in a high school cafeteria explaining why her parents have solstice parties. So it had a happy ending. I'm not sure what difference I made, but I think I made some, certainly to the parents' peace of mind. So that was an effective prayer. There's a couple of things to say about prayer, but I'll say here there's whole volumes of, even on Unitarian Universalist prayer, that I haven't touched on. What I've talked about is just one kind. There's 3 other main categories of prayer that I haven't touched on. For this one, though, there's 2 things to say that I think are really important. First of all, if you listen to what we sang, what the choir sang and what we said, you might think that you be a failure if something in there didn't raise your spirits. Talk about having the Spirit come in. And yet I know that it's a divine truth that sometimes what we are being called to is more tears and more grieving. So sometimes, how to put it, the prayer that says raise your spirits actually is implicitly inviting you to really pay attention to how you're actually feeling, which may not raise your spirits in the moment. And we recognize, what did Mary Mason say about the importance of connectedness? That's when we need the connectedness with one another, is during those times. The other thing I would say is that I don't, whether or not your spirits are raised, I'm not asking you to agree with me about what works as a prayer and what doesn't. And in fact, if you found yourself going, wait, no, Reverend George, I don't like that. That's the point where you come and talk to me and we have a good talk. Because those triggers are the places where your relationship with the divine probably is. Any place where there's a hot edge like that is probably with your relationship with the divine. Remembering that we as Unitarian Universalists, again, another humanist said that we believe in one God at most, so that you may have a relationship with justice or truth or reality with a capital R. But if any of what you heard triggered some important feelings, come and talk to me. I'd be happy to talk to you. Or you can talk to Reverend Joe when he's better, or Reverend Rena. But those feelings are really important. Pardon me. To finish up, it's my hope and prayer this congregation will continue to be a beacon of religious and spiritual freedom, a haven for those who would engage in the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, and a community strengthened by our loving prayers for one another and for our struggling world. May it be so.
At this time, we'll take an offering for the mission of this church and for its well-being. The choir will sing "From You I Receive." Thank you.
As a member of the Board of Trustees, I would like to thank you for your attendance here today and for all the gifts you have brought with you. The gift of your presence, the gift of the care you give to each other, and the gift of financial resources that you share with all of us. Please know that these financial resources are used with diligence and care by your Finance Committee and your board to help sustain this caring community.
Make your
For benediction, I have some words from Rabbi Abraham Heschel. Rabbi Heschel was a 20th century conservative rabbi. He marched with Dr. King in Selma, and he said at the time that he felt in marching, he felt like his feet were praying. Anyway, here's what he had to say about prayer. Prayer invites God to be present in our spirits and our lives. Prayer cannot bring water to a parched land, nor mend a broken bridge, nor rebuild a ruined city. But prayer can water an arid soul, mend a broken heart, and rebuild a weakened will.
Please stand as you're willing and able, and let our journey now take us to our bond of union. You may hold hands if you wish, or not. We join hands in Unitarian Universalist fellowship, pledging ourselves to an individual religious freedom which transcends all creeds, not to think alike, but to journey together. As we extinguish our chalice for today's service, I'll read from Reverend Elizabeth Selle Jones. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.